Perfect. Oh, well, welcome everybody. I have a lot of information in my head and that I've put together in the past. So I've tried to really focus it on to some really primary subjects today. I want to make sure everybody has the tools they need to prepare themselves for anything. So instead of just like really hitting one subject very particular, which we can do in questions later if you want to, I'm going to give you the tools to prepare yourself anywhere you are. I'm doing the same presentation for my sister's ward in a couple of weeks, and they are in England. They're just outside of London, and the principles still apply for everybody. I figure you're probably already sort of familiar with the benefits and the reasons that we prepare, but I did just want to cover a little bit on benefits real quick before we get in. And so here we have: preparedness will improve you and your family's chances of being safe. It can even make the difference between life and death. This is the one everyone thinks of too. Preparedness will help you and your family reduce psychological trauma during and after any event. This is especially important for younger children, but applies to everybody. 3, preparedness will help you make educated and appropriate decisions during events. And this one's really important to me because I want to make sure that I'm making a good choice when it matters the most. And sometimes if we don't have information, we're just looking at either A or B, and we have no way of knowing which one is better. 4, preparedness may give you the knowledge and means to help others who are in need. This one is an extremely important one. We'll cover a little bit more later. 5, preparedness can reduce the physical labor and financial burden of cleanup and getting life back to normal. And then 6, preparedness can help you sleep soundly and live a more peaceful life without being afraid of the unexpected. And I do suffer from a lot of chronic anxiety, so this is a big one for me. Having my things prepared allows me to just set that part of my brain aside and be fine. Even when things in the world are weird or go wrong, I kind of have a peace of mind. There are 5 different categories that I'm going to cover. The first are types of emergencies and how to evaluate them. The second is creating emergency plan. The third will be documents and vital records. We'll talk about physical preparations, and then the ongoing stuff, teaching your family, maintaining the plan, and kind of moving forward afterwards. So these are the categories that we're going to really get into today. So the first one is about evaluating your situation and understanding what an emergency is. So when we live our life in a linear path, right? We kind of go from point A to B. And sometimes we have these big peaks that spike up in the middle of our path where everything changes, where our regular daily routine is adjusted. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about for emergency preparation. We just are moving along, and then all of a sudden, big old spike, we have to deal with something that's out of the normal. Now that's with the expectation that eventually that spike will settle and there will be a little bit more normal. That may be new. We use the term new normal, but things will go back to a little bit more normal after. That spike is the emergency. Now, one of the big reasons I bring this up is because the church teaches in being prepared for an emergency situation. The church does not have principles about teaching for long-term apocalypse, right? We're not trying to be prepared for when all of a sudden a zombie apocalypse is going to come and take over the world and there's never going to be a new normal. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about realistic situations that happen where we have a little bit of a spike and then things settle back down. As we get into that, I want you guys, you'll see the screen here says mental exercise. There's a picture of an elevator. If you were stuck in this elevator for 3 days and 2 nights, and someone gave you a backpack and said you can have whatever you put in this backpack, what would you need or want, right? That is the question. And I just want you to think about that in reality. What would you need or want in this backpack if you knew you were going to be stuck in that elevator for 3 days? And it'll give you a little bit of an idea of how to think through. Some of those things in your mind are going to be very basic. Obviously, you're going to want food and water, but you're also going to start thinking about, wow, that's a really hard floor and it looks kind of boring and uncomfortable. And there may be a few things you want in there for comfort's sake. There may be, hey, what would I give just to have a blanket if I was in that elevator? And then you'll start thinking about things that are unique to you. So for me, for example, I have a lot of medical conditions that I have very specific prescriptions for. I would become very uncomfortable and even maybe have emergency problems if I didn't have those medications with me in that elevator for 3 days. So I have what applies to me. So basic needs, comfort needs, and then needs that are specific to you as an individual. I have a lot of really dry skin. Right now, I would be pretty unhappy if someone put me in that elevator for 3 days without lotion for my hands or chapstick, right? So that's an easy way to categorize the things that you will need and think about yourself personally. Now, don't worry, we're going to get into a lot more detail on how we check these lists here. But I want to show you a couple things. On this page, you are going to notice that there is a little orange box in the bottom corner that says document. It says protection, escape versus shelter. That anytime you see that in the bottom corner, it is directly relating the information I'm talking about on screen right now to a document that each of you are going to get that talks more about the subject. And 100% of the information in the PowerPoint presentation is held within the documents that you guys will receive. That way you can just kind of listen and follow along without having to worry about recording the information that I'm presenting. Here we're talking about the difference between escape versus shelter. There are 4 types of protection that we can encounter when we are in an emergency. The first is the easiest to conceive of, and that is to escape from your home. This is the one that we really focus on for house fires. In that kind of situation, you don't have time to prepare or grab anything. You really are just getting out. And the preparations for that one are about knowing your way out. The second one is evacuating from your area. And this is the one that's a little bit close to a lot of our hearts right now, because there are a lot of people in Ukraine who are evacuating from their area. This also happens in big disasters like hurricanes, or if there's a lot of flooding and damage, we have to leave. We have to leave not just our own home, but our geographical area, usually at least outside of the county, but in some cases outside of the state. In Ukraine, they're leaving their country entirely. And then the bottom 2 are really similar: home refuge and shelter in place. And these are 2 separate categories, mostly because of the way that the government categorizes them. So home refuge means we are taking physical shelter in our home. So this is absolutely one that applies to us if there was a severe storm or tornado, if you have a winter advisory or any type of winter type of thing. The type of natural disasters that are likely to occur here in Madison or in Wisconsin, where a lot of us are located, would require us to take refuge in our own homes to be safe. Now, shelter in place is a little bit different, but similar. We're still taking shelter in our homes, but instead of trying to be protected from all the dangerous winds and type of storm thing they may come, shelter in place happens when the government has determined that it would be best if we were not in our home, but it's too dangerous for us to leave. This particularly happens if there is any type of environmental toxin, whether that is a disease or some type of chemical that has been released, whether there is nuclear fallout, if there was a great deal of civil unrest and it would be unsafe to be on the streets. All of these are situations where the government may issue a shelter in place order, and that is what they call it. When we had COVID start with quarantine early on, some of the news stations used the shelter in place term, but it's a little bit inaccurate. Home refuge means stay home. Don't leave unless you really need to. But we still have to get to the grocery store for food. Some of us still had work. And so what we really did in COVID when we started quarantine was home refuge. When the government issues shelter in place, this usually comes as an absolute. You will not leave your home. You cannot. There are no outside resources. You are stuck in your home, which is one of the biggest differences. The third thing that is really different between these two is that a shelter-in-place order often comes with guidance from the government to seal up every single window and door. You would turn off the ventilation systems, you would put plastic over windows and doors. It is a dramatic change. It's one that we prepare for, but it's much less likely to happen than home refuge, which we know is actually common. So escape from your home with fire, everyone should be prepared for that one. Evacuating from your area looks very different to each of us, given our situations. Home refuge is one all of us are going to take at some point in our life. There are always going to be situations where we just can't quite get out of the house as well, and we need to be safe in our home. So we absolutely prepare for that one. And then shelter in place, that's more extreme. Again, there's really good details on all four of these categories, what they are, and a list of things to go through to make sure that you're prepared for these different situations. And those are all in the document that you guys will be receiving. There are two big major types of emergencies. The first one here is major events. And major events can happen in natural hazards or other issues. And then minor, what we call personal level events, are things that would just happen to us individually. And as we kind of look at these categories here, and again, all of this information is in the document, so this just gives you an idea. We look at floods for Wisconsin, flooding, severe storms, tornadoes. We don't get as much of windstorms, definitely extreme cold. If you guys remember back a couple winters back, we had that big dramatic cold front that moved through, and it was actually pretty dangerous to go out and get things for at least a day and a half or two. We needed to be home, but a lot of people lost power. There were quite a few deaths when that came through for people who lost power and were cold and at home and didn't have things on hand to be prepared for that. We don't get much in the way of heat waves here or earthquakes, but you know, obviously preparing for a volcano wouldn't be something to worry about, but this gives you an idea of the different categories. The second page here shows other issues. I would just like to point out that this information was recorded. The book that I wrote about it was done in 2011. And as I updated a lot of the material for this presentation, there was only one thing that was added to any of these lists, and that was space weather, which is the last one on here. And I kind of went, so space weather is talking about things that happen in conjunction with solar radiation and like sunburst stuff. I know very little about it because it's pretty new, but the complications of space weather are usually a loss of electrical power for a period of time. So it would really overlap with a lot of other preparations we would make. Food shortage and fuel shortages, we've seen a lot of that going on in the last couple of years. Civil unrest and public attacks, you know, these are things that when I wrote my book 11 years ago, I never imagined would be real. And I was counting through all of the disasters, the major events and the personal level events. And in the last 11 years, my husband and I have experienced 6 of them. 6. My mind was completely blown. I couldn't believe of these things that I put together and thought, oh, well, I will never really need the preparation, right? You think that, well, I'm prepared, we're good, but, and we've needed 6 of these things have happened. So pandemic flu or contagious disease, again, these are things that have been on the list for a long time. We'll talk a little more specifically about cyber attack on this list, and we'll talk a little bit more about severe storms and tornadoes in preparations because they are coming up in the future. And then personal emergencies. So this is something that would happen to just you or your family. So a sudden loss of job or income source. Statistically, this is going to happen to most households at some point in their life, even more than once. Basic things, flat tire, the car breaks down, home fire. So all the things on this list are not in a particular order, and there's very differences, right? Most of us are going to end up with car troubles at some point. But a missing child, right? That's not one a lot of us will experience, but it's just the way that we prepare for anything that might come up. basic electrical problems or plumbing problems. Frozen pipes is something we deal with here. Just little things like basic first aid emergencies in your house. There's so many different ways. The basement flooding. If you have a basement and you live in the Midwest in any way, you probably know that most people are going to have some type of basement flooding problem at some point. So it's just good to kind of take each of these different things and we address, am I really at risk for that? If this happened, would I know what to do? Right? And then what would I need? And just taking the moment to sort of think through what those steps are is often a big part of what we need to be mentally prepared for something and understand what we would need to be physically prepared for an event. And we'll talk more about that soon. So here is how we take the whole process. I've already talked about this a little bit, right? We have this list that you guys will be receiving of all the big disasters. And then there's a list of questions in that document that talks about things that are good to know. So it'll ask you, do you know how you would be notified if this kind of an emergency happens? Right? That's one of the big questions. How will you get updates on that type of emergency? You know, what is around you that might be impacted by that kind of an emergency? And then we are going to record our plan. And you can get on the computer and you can do a fancy plan with lots of details, or you can literally just pick up a notepad and write those notes down, right? It doesn't have to be the most complicated thing, but having a recorded plan will help you to be better prepared and put that plan in your mind. So the most important major event to prepare for depends on your geographic area. If you are in one state or another, or one country or another, this changes a lot. The most important personal emergencies are loss of income, death of a loved one, and house fire. So the first two, loss of income and death of a loved one, are unfortunately likely to happen within our adult lives. And I would assume there are probably quite a number of you here watching who have experienced those in your life already. And then the third one, house fire, there is nobody else that can help us or prepare us for a fire within our own home or building that we live. And those preparations, they're on us, and being prepared for that one is vital. Again, we hope nobody ever has a house fire, but we have to be responsible for those. So the next one I want to talk about here goes along with it, and then we'll do a couple of examples. And this is vital records. So an IED profile page, I'll just grab mine here. So I don't want to show too much of the profile page. I'm going to show you kind of sideways so you can't read it. And then you can see in my picture back here, there is an example of the ID page. I'm going to tell you what's on it, but there's a lot of personal information, so I'm not showing you mine more specifically. I hope you can understand that. But in my emergency binder and in my emergency kit and in my 72-hour kit is a picture, a profile facing picture of my husband and I. It has our name, birthday, blood type, allergies, address, phone number, medical conditions, contacts for medical professionals who have more information. It has a description, who we are. You know, mine says glasses, brown hair, blue eyes, 6 months. You know, it just kind of, it goes through the details, and then it has emergency contacts. Having this information is useful for every type of emergency, knowing where it is and having it pulled together. Compiling emergency numbers on here. I keep those two on the same page because it's convenient for me. And then to gather and properly store the vital records. The template sheet you'll see down there is the personal ID sheet. Has a Word document that will kind of have the different categories. And if you download that, you can pop your own picture in place, your own name, your own details, and it has categories to show you where things go. But being able to put all of your financial documents and store them in a safe place is also really important for emergencies and for normal life. So my husband and I's documents, this is my emergency binder. And it literally has all of the important information about us in one place. And there is a really comprehensive document that you'll be receiving that has a list of all of the different types of paperwork that you will want to account for. Some of these don't apply to everybody, and that's why there's a pretty long list. You can see it's 2 full pages, and you're going to go through that and say, okay, is this something that I have? And put it someplace safe. You can just start a folder. When you're beginning this process of pulling paperwork together, you can literally just start a pile on the table somewhere and start putting it all in one place as you gather it together. The benefit of having it here is, I'd say twofold, but it's almost threefold. So the benefit of having it in one place in our own personal lives is that I know where it is when it's time for me to go down and renew my driver's license or something. It's like, oh, where's my birth certificate? And I know it's going to be in the binder. Oh, we need to, register the car, whatever it is, it's going to be in the binder. Oh, I'm participating in a family history activity at church, and I need my church number, my record number. It's in the binder. Just everything is in there, as well as some personal information that I wouldn't want to lose if something happened. So just a basic real life organization. It's nice to have those kind of things organized. Then, of course, if something happens, this is kept, and we keep it on the shelf with the 72-hour kits in this bag here. This is a fire and waterproof bag that we've purchased, but you can use, they come in different sizes. And obviously there are fire boxes and a number of things. So these records are always kept safe and dry. And if there was a fire, they should be recoverable, which of course is important. And then it's also easy to pick up and transport. So if we needed to leave the house, all I have to do is make sure I grab this one binder, and we are bringing every vital piece of information about us that I would want to be safe and record. We're not going to talk a whole lot further about the vital documents because it's going to be really specific to each of you as to what you keep and how you choose to store it. But do not think for a minute that means that this is unimportant. This is actually one of the most important things that I recommend doing and starting with. If you're trying to become prepared for an emergency and you're just overwhelmed with all the information, the number one thing I would recommend doing is organizing and assembling your emergency documents and vital records in case of emergency, because it helps everything else go smoothly. After we get our paperwork together, we are going to safeguard our home and start assembling kits. So you'll find documents in the information. It's tips for safeguarding your home, which is an extensive document that literally walks through check for this, make sure you have this, and kind of putting the household together so that it's safe. Some of those things won't apply to you. And some of them are easy to skip and move on. And others you'll go, oh, I never thought about that. That would be important. And that can be something very generic. So the only one that's not in there is a good example. If you hang all of your clothes up in the closet with the hangers going in and in the same order, there are some fire departments that teach the firefighters to grab handfuls of clothes out of the closet as they're leaving an area. If no one's in danger and they have time, not every fire department teaches that. And I don't know if ours here teaches that, but in Kansas City, when I was speaking to them, that department there did. Having all the clothes hanging in, you could actually have some things brought back to you because they know it's really hard to replace clothing. So there are tips like that in there. And then there are some really basic things like make sure that the knives are kept out of the way of young children if they're in the household. It just lists everything. So you can kind of go through and account for it for your own environment at home. And then the big one that we are going to talk a lot about today is emergency kits. Being prepared with your physical preparations is an extremely important part of what we're doing and where we're going to focus some of our time today. When it comes to an emergency, I'm going to show you a couple things here. In your kits, Especially if you have children, there are emergency wristbands that you can put information on. It's pretty easy to find emergency IDs now on Amazon and other sites, but these will be examples of how those might look. I actually have some really cute ones I ordered for some of the kids in my life that have little design decorations on them. They're kind of these cute, they've got animated characters, and you can use emergency things, and then they seal so that the kids can't take it off again, but they're comfy and easy. They're a little less important for adults, but extremely important for children. In an emergency, the chance of being separated from a child and then not being able to have a child communicate who they are and how to get in touch with you is high. I also have one. My husband is allergic to penicillin, so I have one made for him. And then because I have a lot of medical information, I also keep one. If for some reason I lost consciousness, I would want to make sure that they knew. And doctors and medical professionals are trained to check the left wrist for medical information before being treated. That doesn't mean that everybody in an emergency situation would know that, but they do recommend putting IDs on the left wrist so that it is checked if someone is trained properly to do so. The next picture I'm going to show you is about the way that communication happens during an emergency. This is a graphic. I actually keep one of these in my 72-hour kit, but this is how search and rescue teams and emergency teams communicate if there is ever a search and rescue situation. You'll see in the very top, it shows the date in which it happened, and then it has who was doing that. That right box shows if there were any hazards present that needed to be aware of. And then the bottom one is a scary box. It shows how many people were fine, living, or dead. And in big major emergencies, the people who are in searching, they're searching for people who are alive that they need to help get out and take to a shelter. They are not removing dead bodies from the home. And so a lot of this is done to communicate with additional recovery efforts. This is something I keep in my bag because I forget what the codes are, but because if you were ever away from home and you came back, this would tell you who was in your house and when. It would tell you if they found hazards there, such as flood water, and it would tell you if they found anybody there. It's just a peace of mind thing. I want to know what's going on. So the example image you see, this was a house that was searched during emergency on 9/11. This was not the 9/11 we think of. It was a picture from about 5 years ago during a hurricane evacuation. It shows here the 3505, so the Alpha Company Parachute Infantry Regiment, blah, 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 division who searched it. The NE means that there was no entry, which means that there was damage in the house and that you shouldn't enter it without protection. Like no person should go into the house if they didn't know what I was doing. It's engineeringly unsound. And then the bottom one there shows they found one person alive, which they would have evacuated, and nobody that was dead, which of course is a big positive. So it's how things are communicated. This is what happens when they go searching for people who have not left home when it's dangerous, or if there was a shelter in place order. This is what they would put on the building, and they would evacuate you through particular transport. So it's just useful to know how the emergency system works in these kind of situations. So before we get to, I'm going to back us up just a little bit to our physical preparations. And I want to talk more specifically now about how we make this plan and how we go through it. So the basics of creating a plan, evaluating your situation, and going through those steps to make it a little easier to understand, we're going to do two of them together. So I want to do cybersecurity as a hazard, and I want to do tornadoes. And the reason we're going to do those is because we've got a lot of people who have asked questions about cybersecurity, and it's with everything going on with Russia. And because tornado season, while we aren't known for having a terrible tornado season in Wisconsin, we are coming up on tornado season. It's also the category that I know the most about. I was professionally trained in emergency management for tornadoes. So if you had specific questions, I will be staying on the call after presentation today for quite a while as needed for very specifics. So in the documents that we use, I'm just going to pull a couple things up real quick here. So this is the tips for safeguarding your home. And you'll see in here, it talks about general habits, and some of these will apply to one emergency or another. So for example, keep extra batteries on hand for flashlights and lanterns in your home. That definitely applies to a tornado, but it doesn't apply as much to cybersecurity, right? So learn how to properly turn off utilities and how to turn them back on. This is about keeping your home safe from having leaks or explosions or fires after the fact. This is a big one here. Keep electronic devices up to date with security and software updates. This one does not apply to tornadoes, but it definitely applies to cybersecurity. So the process of going through these lists here, these general habits, things to watch for if you're inside the house, things to watch for when you are outdoors, things to watch for specifically if you have pets or children. If you just kind of read through it and gauge a little bit about what you may need, in the end, you will be prepared for most any situation that you can imagine. The second one on here with emergency kits is probably the document that I get asked for most frequently. And that is 72-hour kits and household kits, as well as additional places that you might need to keep a kit. So here's where we're going to talk for a little bit about how emergencies work. If there is an emergency in your community, if there was a tornado that ripped through our state's general geographic area, right away, we are going to wait for the governor to know what's going on and respond. And then if it's enough of a disaster, there will be a presidential declaration of a disaster area. This is something that we've heard on the news before, but it's actually a really important step. If the president issues a disaster area, then FEMA is able to come in and get started helping and preparing for the area. And there are financial assistance programs and communication programs that become available. If that does not happen, we are reliant on our community for a response. So the degree of the disaster matters in how things get responded. But let's say it was a tremendous tornado with lots of damage and it became a disaster area. There's going to be a little bit of time for communication for that to happen. And when that does happen, FEMA is activated, and it takes them 12 to 72 hours, sometimes more, but 12 to 72 hours to get to a location and start setting up resources. So there is a little bit of this gap in time where we don't always know what's going on. And that's a big part of why the church teaches the principle of a 72-hour kit, because in general, help can be sent to a lot of areas and locations at that 72-hour mark, whereas we might need to take care of ourselves and each other here in our community for a little bit of that time in the middle. I have always loved preparation and emergencies and have been fascinated by the idea. And I read a lot of books when I was younger about survival. And I always kind of imagined that if this disaster happened and everything changed, that we'd be out in the woods and I'd have to learn how to make a fire and build shelter out of wood and keep myself alive and fish and hunt for our own food. And it was this real rustic, rural kind of survival. And it seemed almost a little bit exciting and just like this perspective I had. But that's actually it's not real. Certainly, I'm sure there are some people who've had to learn to survive that way. But most of the time, when these kind of disasters happen, we are settling into the emergency systems that are in place around us. And that includes shelters and transportation and food and water. It just takes a long time for those things to get to us. So when we talk here about the physical preparations, safeguarding is going to work towards many, many things. The kits are going to be specific to you and your family. The 72-hour kits that I absolutely recommend you putting together for each member of your family may be a bulk or most or even all of the preparations that you would need for your household, even if you're utilizing the stuff from those kits while you're at home. You don't have to be evacuating from your home to use those items. So if there's something that is recommended that you have in your home to be prepared, don't pretend like the 72-hour kit doesn't exist. So the household kit, which you'll see on that document after emergency kits, talks about additional things that you may want, but don't overlap them. If you have, let's say, an emergency toothbrush in that, right? Then you're good. You don't need to put an additional emergency toothbrush in the household kit. The one in the 72-hour kit will suffice. It's what you need, so don't overlap the kits as you're going through. There is a little bit of a difference for vehicles. This is one in our particular geographic area where I recommend considering what you would need to have in the car if you got stuck in the snow. Right? So when you're going through the big disaster categories and we're talking about major emergencies, where might you be is a big question, right? It's one of the big questions on the document you'll see. Where would you be? Where would you potentially be traveling to? Where will your other family members be? And how will you communicate with them? I work from home, so I'm likely to be at home during almost anything that happens. And if not, I will be in the car or at a friend's house, church building, something like that. But my husband works full time out of the house. There's a very good chance that if something happened, so let's say there was the tornado example, and it ripped through the area, that I would be here at home and he would be at work. And we may not have the ability to communicate with each other very easily. So putting a plan in place lets everyone in the household know what to do if you can't get in touch. In the emergency information, and that again, that is provided. So if Jeff has contact information, he's at work, and I'm at home, cell phones go down. Sometimes they're destroyed or hard to use. It can be difficult to know. And then sometimes you can get an email or a text message, but you can't get a cell phone through. So learning to communicate in different ways. But for example, we have someone who is a good friend of ours, of the family, that is within walking distance, mostly within walking distance of our house. If we needed to communicate, we can get in touch with them, and then they will know where we are or get to their house. My husband works close enough to home that if something happened, I would stay near our house and he would walk home. He's more physically capable than I am, and it would not take him very long to do so. Even if it was dangerous outside, he could get to me. And so our plan, a lot of our plan is I stay put like a lost child, and my husband comes and finds me. If we really have to meet, we have a meeting place. These are the kinds of things you want to put on an emergency plan. So for the tornado example, you would be taking refuge in your home. So when we talked about the different types of preparations, and we were looking at this sheet here, refuge in your home. So if a tornado alarm goes off, that is how we know. We can check the radio or the news to get that notification. There's actual sirens that go off, and we know to take refuge from a potential tornado. Where in your house is going to be safest for sheltering from that tornado? And that is where your supplies need to be in case of a tornado. I actually keep our 72-hour kits in the closet that we would sit and hold out in if there was a tornado, so they're in the same place. Having a flashlight, clothing, change of clothing, and footwear that is nearby in that location, and an emergency radio. Tornadoes are not going to go on this, they're pretty fast, right? The after effects, then you would have supplies, which is good, but what you basically need in that situation is the basics in where you would be taking shelter. So that's where it really comes to evaluating which of these things are you going to be doing. So what is the disaster? The disaster here, for example, is a tornado. We are going to find out about that tornado through the community emergency response. We have sirens that go off, then we know to take action. That action is going to be to take refuge in our home. In that refuge, if I was going to be stuck there, what might I need? Think about what that is and put those physical preparations in place for it. So for the other example here, we have cyber attack. So currently we are not under any alerts, just to be clear, for cyber attacks. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is the government agency that tracks this. And it's the CISA.gov. They have a program that is called Shield Up, and that is going to tell you if there are any threats. So currently the Shield Up threat says there are no current threats, but everybody should be more vigilant because of this war with Russia and Ukraine, because Russia does have a history of cyber attacks on the United States. Something to consider here is that your direct personal needs and information are probably not what's at risk if they're stored at home and for yourself. Your individual computer is probably not what's at risk here. Most are going to be major transportation, medical, and financial companies. And so that's a lot of the information that is provided by the agency, how to protect. If you own a bank, how do you protect your bank so that you protect the customers from your bank, right? That's where a lot of that happens. The steps that we can take to protect ourselves on a personal level are going to sound really familiar, right? This is to make sure you have strong passwords. So you're not going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as a password, but a lot of systems now force you to diversify a password enough that our passwords are protected. Using two-step authentication on passwords is starting to become the normal protocol. And I noticed there's actually a couple companies that I work with that just changed to where it was mandatory. And I think because of the preparations and fear with this war going on in Ukraine. So passwords and two-step authentication. If you are used to computers and you have experience with computers, there are a lot of apps and programs that can help you do this more easily. I recommend researching into them. If not, try and keep your passwords just diversified and safe. Follow the directions that you're given on anything you're logging into, and maybe Heidi and I can talk about doing a more specific subject one time. If we do further communication going out, we can do a subject specifically on protecting your passwords, because that's actually a whole course all by itself. The other one is to think before you click on anything on the computer. If you get an email or anything that comes up when you're online and you're not sure what something is, don't follow the click here to win $100 button in the middle of the screen. Use the little X in the top corner to click out of that box. Don't just click on things. Think about what it is you're clicking on and try to educate yourself on what is safe to click on and not. And then the last one is to make sure you always do updates on your electronic devices. We actually had a Microsoft update that went out 3 days ago. That update was pretty fast. It was easy. It went out on most devices, and it was specifically to upgrade the security on those devices to account for really frequent ways that Russia uses for cybersecurity, right? These companies are already doing a lot of it for us, but they're going to update regularly based on what's going on. Make sure you keep everything up to date. Update information, not just on security, but also on software. That's how we make sure we take advantage of the security programs and systems that are in place. When we talk about being prepared for other issues like a cyber attack, a lot of the things that are put in place for this are going to be helpful. Having all of your vital documents in one place and knowing where they are, having basic things stored. So if you have a lot of pictures that are important, having copies of them at someone else's house or having copies in a firebox, all those things are going to be helpful. So when you start going through the information on the safeguarding and details on things that I've provided, those steps are going to prepare you for multiple things at once. So outside of the two examples that we talked about with tornadoes and cybersecurity, there are a couple more things I wanted to make sure that we covered here. So know how to use all the items that you've gathered. This is a really important one. If you have some really fancy pocket knife, but you don't even know how to open or what's in it, it's not going to be as useful to you. For example, if you have a water filtration method, know how to use it if you're going to have it. Just having the items isn't helpful. Having and knowing how to use the items is helpful. Reevaluate your plan from time to time. I was really grateful for the opportunity to teach this program because we just moved to a new place a little over a year ago, and I hadn't updated all my information. And I am passionate about emergency preparation, but there's just been so much going on in the world. And I was really grateful for the reminder to update, to go back in and update. When you're talking about 72-hour kits, updating your food is best done every year because food expires so quickly. My favorite way to do this, my mom, when I was younger, we would have a picnic. So she would go through, she would pull the 72-hour kits down. Each summer, we would take all the food from our 72-hour kits and we would take a blanket out to the middle of the park somewhere, and we would eat the food that was in our kit, which helped my mom know what was useful in the kits and to know what worked or not. And then we didn't waste the food. Then she would go to the store and she would pack new food into the thing. But again, then we would use that food for the picnic the next year. It was really fun. It was an enjoyable thing as a child to do a 72-hour kit picnic, and I looked forward to that. So I definitely recommend putting steps like that in place, especially for little kids. It becomes exciting and fun at the same time. Don't become emotionally attached to physical preparations. This one is really important. My 72-hour kit is a tool. It is something that I have that helps, that I can utilize if something goes wrong. If I become emotionally attached to these physical items, then I can have a problem. If there is a disaster or something that occurs around us, then we can actually have problems. And then what about realistic situations? So for example, during Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of people that had to evacuate up north, and there was a stake. It was a really beautiful Ensign article, but I couldn't find the actual article. But there was a stake just north that was not as impacted, but a lot of evacuees came up that area and was in shelters. They were really supporting a lot of the evacuation. And the stake president asked for all of the members of the stake to gather together their 72-hour kits and bring them to the church so that those supplies could be given to the people who were in shelters and needed them. And this was a big impact to me and why we prepare and what we're doing, because sometimes our preparations really are for us in our own situation. But in that situation, the stake president was asking that the members give those preparations to someone who is immediately in need of them. And having that in my mind has always helped me to disconnect emotionally from the preparations and prepare myself for wanting to help others in case of an emergency. It can be useful to understand those needs that others may have by being prepared, but then to actually give them. And in the end, you're really just talking about a fairly reasonable financial gift that they would be giving, but that's very replaceable, right? You give these physical preparations to someone who needs them, and then you just have to buy a new bag and fill it back up again with the list of everything that goes in it. So there doesn't have to be this connection between this is life or death for you. This is a tool that we utilize to help ourselves or others if needed. And the same thing goes into case, let's say that there was a huge tornado that ran through the area, but it wasn't here, it was in Sun Prairie. Consider in your mind, if the stake president or your bishop reached out and said, we're trying to support others, do you have friends that you would invite into your house that you could be an emergency place for? Would you have strangers into your home? Would you provide food and blankets and things for them? You know, how prepared are you to help others if something happened? And while it's best to focus on being prepared yourself, don't ignore the mental and spiritual preparations of you and others around you. Being spiritually prepared is one of the best ways to be emotionally prepared for anything. The last one on this list here is balance. And I leave that word all by itself because it is really important that we remember to balance the way that we prepare for emergencies with absolutely normal life. So you're going to think of things based on the list, what is likely to happen, make basic preparations for it, and then move on with life. right? Keep a balance in what you're doing. And I keep this one on here to remind myself a little bit too. I love being prepared. I love survival things. I want to find that really cool little multi-tool that has a hammer and a saw and screwdriver knife and spend a ton of money on it. Exactly. That's not very balanced. It's fun, but it's not balanced. Most of what you would need for a 72-hour kit, you can gather in your home from basic things. So when it comes to physical preparations, I am going to throw a few tips at you really quick, and then I'll open up for any questions that you have. And I don't know how much you guys know about physical preparations, but there are a lot of information that is probably going to be coming specific to kits when it comes to the other presentations coming up on lights, heat, fuel, first aid, sanitation, cooking, clothing, and communication. So I tried not to get hyper detailed into those categories, but I do want to show you in the 72-hour kits that I put together, I create micro kits. So everything to help with health, I put in a separate bag. I label these bags, and this helps to keep things waterproof long-term. It helps them to be organized in your supplies, and it would help you or somebody else know what they were looking for or finding. So like this one here is the warm kit. This includes everything to help keep you warm or to create emergency shelter. If you really did need to put a tarp up in the middle of the woods, you would have the supplies to do so. But this is also going to help you keep warm in a shelter or in a transport van on the way to a friend's house or wherever it is that you find yourself in an emergency. So just another example here, then hygiene, keeping clean. Again, everything to have for hygiene is kind of in one place. So I didn't get super detailed into the items that I keep in my 72-hour kits, in my household kits, because they are all listed in the paperwork. But I'm happy to show you guys details and very specifics about what I use and what I keep. And I do have a lot of examples around me in case you have questions. But because of the time and where we're at, I want to make sure that I'm balancing that with what we're doing. So I know the presentation wise, we've got about 20 more minutes before questions, but I feel really strongly that your guys' questions are probably going to lead to more specific information in what it is that I'm presenting. I want to meet your needs. So if you want to start thinking about what those questions are and be prepared with them, I'm going to show you a couple more things that I recommend, but start thinking about what those questions are. So when we talked about the elevator thing, right? What would you want in the bag if you were stuck in an elevator? Sometimes your answers might be a little bit different. And there's a list of things, right? I've got that whole document that I've provided to you guys, and it is going to go through. I'm going to scroll, don't get too dizzy here. It's going to go through all the things. So warmth and shelter, it goes through all the things to have for that. Utilities, health, it literally lists out everything that you might need. Same thing for household kits, same thing when you get down to, it'll talk about, so if you have infants at home, extra things for toddlers at home, it's for pets. Also what you might want on hand for vehicles. Again, this is literally just going through one thing after another and what those might be utilized for. But what isn't on the list is what I want to talk a little bit about. So I'm going to tell you guys the things I have in my kit that are not on the list. So when it comes to things about keeping busy, my husband and I really love games. So I do keep games in, each of us has a game in our 72-hour kit, and then we have a little bit more in the household one because that helps to entertain us. My sister and her family, they read a lot. So she has books in there to just kind of sit and read a book. I do have a little bit, these are mostly recommended for children, but it's just a little bit of a fidget device. It's fairly small, and I keep one on hand because for me, having my hand occupied in an emergency is a really good way to reduce anxiety for me. So even as an adult, I do keep one. In addition to the comfort and entertainment, I have a travel blanket that goes in mine. This one zips up real small, but it opens up into a blanket. If I have a blanket or something soft that I can cup to my chest, it's one of the ways that I self-soothe. It's comforting to me. And so having that in the kit is a really good way of comforting me. Some people don't care. That may not apply to you at all. So again, this is something because I know myself and what I personally need in an emergency. I also have my glasses are super, where I don't see well at all without my glasses. So I have a prescription, both my glasses and sunglasses, my last prescription before they changed. And I do recommend that. They aren't perfect, but they're usually going to be close enough to what you had to put in there. My husband wears contacts, so we have glasses and contacts in his. If I want to put my hair up, this really doesn't apply to, like, most men don't have a lot of hair, a lot of people don't have it, but I have enough hair that I want to put it up in a bun, or I live in pigtails most of the time, so extra hair bands. That's specific to me, right? The last one on here is a little bit amusing. I suffer from a lot of overheating, and then it impacts my health. And so while you could fan yourself with just about anything, I actually have a fan in my kit because it's just super effective, and because I know that it's part of how I feel better. And again, it's entertaining and comfortable to me. This is not in a 72-hour kit list. You're probably not going to find this in anybody's 72-hour kit list. But if I was stuck in an elevator for 3 days, this is something that I would want. So it helps me to know in an emergency. The last thing I have in front of me here to show you guys is something that was recommended by a friend who actually spent quite a while in an emergency shelter after Katrina. So she was there for quite some time because they were waiting for transportation to get out. So at the emergency shelter, they were evacuated and taken to the shelter. And then they have friends and family who they could stay with, but were in other states. And so they were able to communicate with them, but they have to wait for those friends and family to be able to drive to get and pick them up, or you have to wait there for the regular first aid, the emergency transportation to take you out of the area. If you don't have a car to jump into and there's no public transportation going, you can only walk so far. So they were stuck there for a couple of days while they waited for her dad to come and get her and her kids and her family. And so even though they were well prepared, they had 72-hour kits, they were members of the church, and they had everything they needed, they still weren't able to evacuate because of damaged roads. So it took time in the shelter. You just never know how things are going to go. She says the most interesting thing that was useful to her, where she had 3 young boys, was that somebody in the area took a bunch of beans and wrapped them up into some scrap cloth and tied it off. And the kids would throw this makeshift bean bag around like a ball. So balls would bounce and be noisy and they go rolling all over. But this bean bag was easy to toss. And she said they ended up making about 100 of them because it was occupying not only the children, but even the adults would just sort of sit there and chat and toss this bean bag back and forth. So I do have a very small little, just a homemade bean bag. This one actually has rice in it. Having rice in it also means that if you have a heat source, you can heat up the device and you can put it on a wound to kind of give a little bit of soothing support. So I like rice better, and jasmine rice is softer and smells good versus beans can be a little hard. So as it turns out, the most useful thing in all of her preparation was something they made up and ended up being a bean bag. So when you're thinking about what you need, basics are good, but learning to be flexible and thinking about how you're going to occupy your time in an emergency is also a really important one. And so now I definitely recommend, this is just a small one, but I can absolutely see sitting on a cot with my husband, bored back and forth, and have played whatever game we brought 100 times, and just tossing this beanbag back and forth is a really useful thing. So advice from a woman who went through the situation that we're talking about, and that was her number 1 recommendation. Her number 2 recommendation, by the way, was to have plenty of wipes, staying clean. She said that the shelter that they were in was clean, but it smelled horrible because you have a lot of people without showers or really easy washing areas. And then the third thing that she recommended was actually a smaller bag. And so this is something I keep. It's just a little over the shoulder bag. If there was an emergency and I was in a shelter and I needed to go to the bathroom, I wouldn't have to bring everything with me. I could just put some hygiene basic products in here. Or if you were out walking for a long distance, then those personal items like a cell phone, for example, or chapstick or lotion can be at your waist and easy to get to. So based on her recommendations, those were the things that she brought up. All right, I'm gonna switch off of my share screen here and back over to YouTube here for a minute so that we can open up to a little bit more in the realm of questions. And just closing up my stuff here real quick.